Honestly, the only reason that comes to mind why people wouldn't move to a place like this is maybe because of like some type of environmental issue. Like there's a lot of storms, something like that. But, and also, yeah, if you build a city just like that, like not everybody's going to move there directly. But apart from that, it seems like paradise to me.
Like your personal data is floating around out there just waiting for someone to snatch it up. Well, it's a real concern. Understanding the full scope of how Forest City landed up abandoned is a broad... Understanding the full scope...
Sorry. Just trying to put the volume down a little
of how
bit.
Forest City landed up abandoned is a broad, complicated topic, but we'll do our best to summarize the key points for you. There are two stories that we need to follow. That of the Chinese real estate bubble and that of private real estate investment firm Country Garden Holding. Let's start with the former. China experienced a real estate boom kicking off around 2003. It was at that time that the Chinese government changed its attitude towards ownership of real estate. Having previously subscribed to the idea that real estate should be collectively owned, in the early 2000s the government warmed up to the idea that private real estate ownership could be rather good for the economy. Accompanying the shift in policy was Premier Wen Jiabao, who in an effort to kick off the new market encouraged Chinese banks to offer cheap credit to those looking to invest in or buy property. An additional factor to keep in mind is how saving money works in China. If you have savings as a Chinese resident, simply putting the money in the bank isn't really an option. While money in Chinese banks does earn interest, that interest just doesn't keep pace with inflation. So ultimately, money left in the bank gradually loses value rather than gaining it, heavily incentivizing Chinese residents to invest their savings. But invest in what? Well, real estate is an excellent opportunity, and with the market suddenly booming, everyone with a bit of cash was eager to jump in and get involved. So, China went from having almost no real estate market to suddenly having countless middle-class and upper-middle-class Chinese residents collectively pouring in millions. The sudden economic shift, as you would expect, resulted in real estate prices gradually starting to climb. Exacerbating the situation was regional Chinese governments, almost all of which also decided to get in on the exploding new market. Eager for a bit of quick revenue and more or less being given the green light, the regional governments of almost every province started to gather up investment capital, develop lands with housing or retail outlets, and then sell or rent the property out as quickly as possible. At this point, however, everything was going exactly according to plan. The booming real estate market was indeed invigorating the Chinese economy, and the government was getting its slice of the pie. But lest there be any doubt, thrusting a lucrative new market into an already established economy is going to have consequences. An economic bubble began to form, real estate prices began to soar, and investors responded with a knee-jerk reaction. Everyone that could started to frantically buy up as much property as they possibly could, with some reports saying that certain investors snapped up dozens or even hundreds of properties. But importantly, the buy-up wasn't happening because the investors intended on developing the property. They were simply speculating that prices would continue to climb and then they'd walk away multi-millionaires. Now, the Chinese government obviously hadn't intended on creating a spiraling speculators market, but that...
Does that mean that most Chinese residents owns property? Do most people in general own property? I have the same little cactus things. These are lovely. They're from IKEA.
is exactly what they got. The bubble continued to grow, and before long, average property values had tripled, while prime real estate in bigger cities had gained up to 10 times its original value. As a byproduct, those middle-class Chinese citizens looking to invest suddenly couldn't even afford local real estate, once again leaving them with savings and nowhere to invest it. That's where Country Garden Holding came in. Forest City was first proposed as a 20-year investment project in 2006, right about the same time when Jiabao was encouraging local real estate investment. The core concept of Forest City was a luxury island established off the coast of Malaysia, specifically in the Johor Bahru district. The island was to be self-contained, would offer ample living spaces, and would have its own schools, its own shopping malls, and would even provide a host of luxury amenities. Now, if you're thinking that there wasn't an island off the coast of Malaysia, well, not to worry, the island was to be reclaimed from the sea, otherwise known as artificially created. That the decided on construction zone was designated a wetland of international importance under the Ramsar Convention was more or less just ignored, including a strict declaration that no development should occur in the area unless that development was nature tourism or for research and education. As a consolation, the single large island was ultimately reduced to a series of 4 smaller islands, though the first of the 4 that now exists, 3 square kilometers in size, still violates countless conservation guidelines. Okay, so now let's turn our attention to the company responsible and the biggest player in today's story, Country Garden Holding. Country Garden saw what was happening in the Chinese real estate market.
But isn't that kind of a weird way to make a city? Like, you build the city first and then bring the people? Wouldn't it usually happen kind of gradually?
And, well, credits where it's due, came up with a rather genius idea. The Chinese middle class were priced out of the local market, so surely they'd embrace the idea of investing offshore, namely in Malaysia. Forest City was therefore, by design, a means for Chinese residents to maintain their savings with an investment in affordable luxury real estate. Initial investment in Forest City was strong, and Country Garden Holding went ahead, pouring an initial few million into establishing the first artificial island. The kickoff phase of Forest City followed, going swiftly into construction and seeing its grand opening in 2016. Only about 14% of the intended city was completed, but even this taste test included multiple towering apartment blocks collectively capable of housing around 700,000 people. The other 3 islands would follow after the first sold out, Country Garden insisted, indicating that the company clearly expected units to sell like hotcakes. And why wouldn't they? The grand opening was attended by the Malaysian Prime Minister, Najib Razak, who, in an effort to boost interest, declared Forest City a duty-free zone. Popular Sultan Ibrahim Ismail of Johor likewise gave his official approval, all but setting the stage for what would be a buying frenzy. Keep in mind that Country Garden, in conjunction with Malaysian state government subsidiary Kumpulan Prasarana Rakyat Johor, had collectively invested around $100 billion. It was at this time, however, that things started to go oh so wrong. A series of unfortunate events kicked off and wouldn't stop until Forest City was transformed into the ghost town that we know today. Alright, let's roll the clock back to 2008. The real estate bubble was...
Right, because for now it seems like a great place to be. I don't get it.
Alright, let's roll the clock back to 2008. The real estate bubble was expanding out of control. Businesses and private residents were eagerly snapping up real estate, and regional Chinese governments were leaning heavily into quick turnaround investment opportunities. Well, that's when the global financial crisis hit. The world tightened its collective belt, and China suddenly found itself with significantly less demand for its exports. This, of course, was a serious problem, and if steps weren't taken to course correct, the entire country would head into recession. So, seeing where the economy was showing the signs of strongest growth, the government released a stimulus package of $568 billion, almost all of it directly into infrastructure development and real estate. The good news is that the stimulus package worked, and the Chinese economy stormed through the financial crisis virtually unscathed. The bad news is, and you can surely see where this is going, that the stimulus package also ballooned the real estate bubble into a swollen nightmare. Provincial governments, having already leaned into real estate development projects, now turned the dial up to overdrive. $500 billion was up for grabs, and governments wanted as much of it as they could get their hands on, pouring more and more into development projects that were quickly getting less and less affordable. More to the point, even poorly thought out, inefficient, and downright ill-conceived projects were being greenlit, many of which failed outright and weren't producing any return on investment. So while it seemed like China was enjoying a wave of exciting economic development, in reality the real estate market was getting oversaturated and overpriced while provincial governments were amassing billions in debt. By 2011, the Chinese government saw what was happening and frantically slammed on the brakes, deciding to implement deflation measures before the market collapsed. New policies, now aimed at curbing real estate investment, were hastily rushed into practice. The key policies included a 40% down payment requirement, as well as restrictions preventing buyers in major cities from owning more than 2 properties. Topping it all off was a new property sales tax, the most surefire
So basically making it impossible.
way to dampen any booming market. As was the intention, real estate prices began to drop, finally bringing the situation under control. Or at least, the market was now under control as far as the government was concerned. For those speculative buyers that had been throwing millions into the thriving market, what they heard was the abrupt clanging of alarm bells. Speculative investors were now at risk of losing everything, and they responded in the only way they could. They panicked. So, following years of rampant investment into real estate, the market turned suddenly into a frantic sell-off. The sell-off got so chaotic that some even started selling valuable property at a fraction of what it had originally been bought for, swiftly leading the market into potential disaster. The government took action.
Now that's when you want to invest.
Again, this time introducing a policy
That's
that
wild.
forbade property being sold if the price was lower than 20% of the established market value. With that chaos playing out, let's turn our attention back to Forest City.
That's
The real
wild.
estate market developments in China weren't necessarily
Imagine you pay like $1 million for to buy a house or you invest in a house, and then this happens, and now you're like, oh my goodness, nobody's gonna buy it off of me, and nobody can live there because, so you're like, I'm gonna sell it, like even if it's for the fraction for the buyers, because I don't want to hold on to it, and then they take that from you as well. Like, that's just wild.
a problem for the offshore investment strategy. Local property prices were still up, even if they had been somewhat tamed, and middle-class citizens were still struggling to find investment opportunities. So, naturally, initial Forest City sales were strong, and the project was set to be a success. But here comes the first spanner in the works. The government was well aware of the debt the provincial governments had been racking up, and was likewise getting concerned about the rising inflation indirectly caused by the $500 billion stimulus package. So, the last thing the government wanted was enormous sums of cash flowing out of China rather than into the local economy. Hence, leader Xi Jinping, again attempting to control a situation his government had created, decided to impose an annual foreign spending limit of $50,000 for all Chinese citizens. While implementing the new policy, Xi Jinping made the statement that has acted as a guiding principle for the Chinese real estate market. Houses are for living in, not for speculation. Thus, the first nail was hammered into Forest City's coffin. Sales began to slow dramatically, but Country Garden Holding clung to their multi-billion-dollar investment.
I feel like this could still be a very successful project, though. Right? I mean, I don't know what the prices are, or how difficult it is to buy property now there, but I would still move there.
Sales began to slow dramatically, but Country Garden Holding clung to their multi-billion-dollar investment, hoping the tides would again turn in their favor. The tides did indeed change, but not in a favorable direction. Malaysia ran into its own political crisis starting around 2018. Now, we're not going to go into details here, but integral to this story is that Prime Minister Najib Razak, who had enthusiastically supported Forest City, was unexpectedly replaced by Mahathir Mohamad, who was openly opposed to an influx of new Chinese residents. Investors, already cautious about putting their money into a politically unstable region, were sent running for the hills as Mahathir Mohamad called Forest City a negligent waste of money and declared that he intended on banning foreigners from purchasing the dwellings. This wasn't a ban he was able to follow up on, given the legal ramifications, but sales for Forest City now more or less ground to a complete halt. Any remaining embers of hope were quickly snuffed out by the COVID pandemic, which swept the world. As it stands, it's rather difficult to get a real estimate of how many units were sold or how many residents stay in the handful of occupied apartments. As far as sold units are concerned, an estimate says around 15,000 of the apartments were purchased in 2019. Estimates of residents living in the apartments vary drastically from just 500 to around 9,000, though these numbers often include the small army of workers responsible for keeping the city maintained. Whatever the real numbers, it's pretty safe to say that Forest City has failed spectacularly. Though, for a bit of additional perspective, Forest City really is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the frankly gobsmacking aftermath of the Chinese real estate bubble. The world...
But it does look really pretty, though. But yeah, I mean... Governments.
is all but littered with fully abandoned or partially abandoned development projects that are either far too expensive to rent out, or were never sold at all, or were never needed in the first place. Some of the most infamous examples include the Kangbashi New area in Inner Mongolia, where living space for 300,000 currently only has 30,000 residents. The new South China Mall, the biggest mall in the world, offers 2,300 retail spaces, of which only 47 are occupied. In the city of
Wow.
Tianjin, office space was erected so quickly and so haphazardly that a recent estimate suggested the buildings won't actually be needed for another 25 years. As far as Forest City is concerned, there are signs that the project may regain some sort of life. Perhaps most telling is that Country Garden Holding has continued to keep Forest City structures well maintained and seems adamant to keep doing so, this despite talks that the project would be sold or seized as part of a debt restructuring effort. The latest Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim, meanwhile, also seems to have warmed up to the project, even making an effort to reignite foreign interest.
I mean, I think it has a lot of potential.
August 2023, Forest City was declared a special financial zone with incentives aimed at attracting skilled overseas workers. There's no official word on how well the incentives are working, though Country Garden Brands manager Shi Yu claimed in December 2023 that Forest City now had close to 10,000 residents. That number is a bit questionable, but based on more unbiased reports, it does seem that most visiting the area go primarily to enjoy duty-free alcohol. Almost all visitors still leave before sundown, though, mostly because the dark, empty streets are reportedly really creepy.
Really? That's wild. But I think that the project has a lot of potential. I mean, it looks really nice. Fendi, you think so too? That's nice. You don't have to voice your opinions always. But yeah, I would live there, guys. I mean, I don't know what the government is like, if I actually knew, everything, then that I could make a better decision. But just off the looks and kind of like the feel of the place, it looks really nice. So, but either way, guys, thank you so much for joining me for this video. I really hope you liked it. Please leave a like, subscribe if you haven't yet, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye!